we've recently started a series of episodes on what happened to the internet, right? Because it's
Yeah.
there's all these things. They feel like they're all happening at once, but they've been happening over a long period of time. It's just that we're starting to really see it
Yeah.
entering the end game now, right? So, in order to understand how we ended up here, we kind of have to talk about the slippery slope that got us to where we are today. In the
Hmm.
previous episode, we talked about the dot com crash and how that affected the market. And today we'll be talking about how we got to the point where every tool that you want to use, even if you're just going to use it once, demands that you first create an account and then you buy a subscription. Now, I know we all love to have a gazillion accounts and a gazillion passwords, right? It's just the thing to do. But I remember, I'm dating myself here because nobody else will. No, I'm joking. But in the past, you you
We're here
used
a
to have,
week.
yeah, exactly. No, but in the past, you'd have a trial version for the app, right? Like a demo
Mm.
version of the app, and then you would have the option to buy it, right? Now you
Yeah.
may get like a 7 day trial or a 30 day trial, but there's never really an option to buy, just to rent. And you obviously this is not something that happened overnight, but from your experience, how, and more importantly, why does this type of change occur?
Well, I mean, I think the 60,000 foot view is recurring revenue, right? Anyone who's run a business,
Right.
it's the cliche about the first thing you learn or the real lesson you learn in business is cash flow,
MRR.
right?
Yeah.
You can be making money, but your cash flow can still bring you to your knees, right? If you don't have money actually turning up when you need it. And businesses just love the idea of that recurring revenue, of revenue continuing. And I think the thing is that it's actually always been around. So if you look at very early on in computing, there were a lot of pushes to try and own the computer that the user was using, to lease it to them somehow, etc. And the issue has been a combination of a few interesting things. One reason that it's become possible is that payments became easier. People are more prepared now to put a credit card on the internet, which very early on that was something that people worried about. But then also people have just gotten more used to actual subscriptions. So when you didn't have any web subscriptions, it would have seemed like a really strange idea to subscribe to your software. And so it wasn't something that businesses thought they could do to users. If you look at corporate software, I mean, right from the start, it was often accompanied by large consulting contracts or other things, which were where the vendor was actually making all the money. And so what that kind of makes me feel is the way I tend to see it because of that is it's really been about what businesses thought they could get away with. It's the drive is, and again, you don't need to place an evil person at the center of this. It's much better explained by a bunch of people running a company trying to satisfy shareholders or investors or anything, and looking at the problem in narrow terms of how do we generate that revenue, and that's kind of the driving force. But I think it's kind of maybe interesting to track through like some of that history of like how it happened and so forth, because yeah, I mean, there was a long time when paid for software was maybe like people had freeware or freemium models where you could use it, you had certain features that you needed to pay for, etc. But at least when you bought it, it was then yours, or at least that version was. So if a significantly new version came out, like buying a new Buick or something, you would buy the new Photoshop. But it was still, businesses felt they had to deliver something genuinely and visibly new to users. Like it had to have new features, and you would have to sell them to people. So you would have things like a launch where you would talk about now we've improved the clipping tool so you can remove backgrounds better, or whatever it was in Photoshop that made it worth upgrading to the newest one. And the other side of that was that businesses at the time didn't have a good way, particularly when software wasn't, when people weren't online most of the time. It was very hard to then regulate what they did. They could just keep their computer off the internet and you'd never know what they were doing. So you had to then account for the fact that a lot of people keep using Photoshop too because they're happy with it. And then they'll, maybe when they buy a new computer, they will buy Photoshop 3. And so I think it's a kind of interesting thing, but all of the indicators point to it basically being something that I think has always been desirable to vendors of just about anything to get multiple payments instead of one for what they're selling. But it's just been a matter of can they achieve it or can they get away with it that has determined whether it happens, right? Do they have the
Right.
ability to charge you every so often? Can they actually make that happen? And then will you just tell them to sod off if they keep asking, or will they have a chance of being able to extract the money from you? And when both of those things are true, it tends to be a desirable way for companies to go.
Right. And I'm thinking also, okay, so you have the economical incentives, right? But at the same time, like you said it, not everyone can actually pull this off because if you're Adobe and you have no competition, you can pull it off. But the problem is that right now, if you just go on the internet and you get recommended a tool to do one thing or another, it's like a tool that you never heard of in your life.
Yeah.
It most likely has a subscription.
Yeah.
There used to be like levels to this game, and now everybody's trying to do this one thing. And
I think
how do you end up there?
well, there are some bastions left, and it's really weird because I think your point is a really strong one. A lot of this is psychological because, again, like a lot of corporate equipment, whatever it is sold with some kind of subscription plan, at least for servicing or help or maintenance or something, right? A warranty. And businesses accept that. And I think the idea, at least, is that those businesses have someone or multiple people who can do the maths and who can work it out and say, well, it's worth, 2 days without our printer is bad enough that it's worth paying $300 a year to make sure that we keep using our printer, in any case. So we'll get a service person out if we need it. That's the kind of idea there, and businesses seem to buy that. Where you see holdouts in the consumer space, where people are less likely to accept that kind of thing, are things like, say, the iPhone, where there have been hugely controversial issues of like Apple being accused of intentionally bricking or slowing down old phones to push people to buy new ones, right? The phone companies, at least in Australia and large parts of the US and so forth, have kind of run a subscription to keep the latest phone, right? You get a 2-year phone plan at some exorbitant rate, and then that keeps you get a new phone every 2 years, which is interesting because it seems like people will accept that from the phone company, but because they expect to pay a regular fee, whereas they won't accept that from a phone company, a hardware manufacturer, because it doesn't seem right that you would need to pay again for hardware. And at the same time, you can see like auto manufacturers have long tried to convince people. So it's been a psychological game to get you to feel like you need the new Buick, right? Because otherwise, people just don't buy enough cars for them.
Right. I hear what you're saying, and when you go on this like psychological angle, it also makes me, like I remember the cars. I think BMW had the heaters built into the car, but if you wanted to use them, you have to get a subscription, which
Yep.
it doesn't really make sense unless it's part of a broader strategy, right? This is not something that you're just trying out because you have the upfront cost of actually
Yep.
installing the heater in the seat, and then you're just selling access to that. So.
Yep.
That's what I'm coming back to it, and maybe this is like a left field question, but And it's very easy to look back through the other end of the telescope and say like, oh, now I understand what happened, 100 years ago
Mm.
or 10 years ago. But like you said, is it more like human nature in the current system that we're in, which is like a credit system?
Mm.
So basically, you kind of have to get all you can get and move that into something that is more of a tangible asset because everything else is depreciating. Could that be an
Um,
angle?
I think that's part of it. I think a lot of it is what people are used to,
Right,
right? And so I think it's also been a classic case that companies have seen what they can get away with, right?
right.
So Apple did the kind of weird inverse where they put that U2 album on everybody's iPhone, and it really annoyed people, and they found that out, right? Similarly, Amazon have done a lot of whoopsies, which were clearly, to my mind, they don't make mistakes like that. They were clearly intentional things like pulling people's copies of books off their Kindles to see how, and then arguing it was because of some legal stoush, but then seeing what the response was because they were trying to work out, is there a way, why do we have music streaming but book buying on ebooks? Again, I think it's purely because of what people will accept as customers, and the companies are then therefore, if they're smart about it, looking for ways to get people used to the idea of the subscription, or forcing them toward that. But one of those two, because obviously that's the direction they want to go in, and they're trying to engender a place where people will accept it.
Right, exactly. And this idea of forcing people into this mindset of subscriptions, you can extrapolate that train of thought and say, wait a minute, but don't I have a subscription to the state when I
Mm.
pay my taxes every year? That's my subscription for healthcare,
Mm.
roads, police,
Yeah.
electricity, garbage, all that stuff. And you see that while you're paying these taxes every year, at the same time, the state is unbundling bits of their subscription under the guise of, they're not effective under state governance. They need to
Mm.
be put on the market, and the market can help us solve these issues. Could it be so that, if you're, let's say, Amazon, and you see the state behaving like this, doesn't that like kind of give you an incentive? If these guys are doing it, if they can just remove services from the
Mm.
subscription, why can't we remove books from your from your
Well,
if you're
I think it's yeah. I mean, I think they're kind of exploring everything. So the question
yeah,
there again is, is how much do they feel like they can do this, and how much does it help that you have shrinkflation and people are
oh,
getting used to that, and you have these diminution of services, and then also yes, the unbundling of things. Because I mean, this is the thing. It's probably a good time to kind of come to it. Like, there are things that I subscribe to where I think it's exactly the right way to pay for that thing. So the classic example is niche podcasts, right? Where there's a few podcasts I subscribe to which are on Linux and open source, or like this one which is just like history of semiconductor technology and so forth, which is like thoroughly nerdy. And I don't think there's necessarily an audience that, for instance, advertising will support that creator. And I value it enough that either way I'd prefer it without ads. So happy to support, right? And I think I made a quip in the pre-show. It makes me feel like a little Medici. I'm patronizing the arts. I'm doing something useful and good with my life. I don't think that's a bad thing. I have a contract, unspoken or via Patreon or something, with that creator to keep getting content. And yeah, I would drop my subscription if they said, look, I've got a job painting houses, I'm not doing this anymore. I'd be like, okay, fine, thank you for the content. And there's nothing wrong with a subscription model per se, right? The issue we've got is with the attempt to apply it to places where it's really not appropriate, right? And so we see that extending from things where maybe it would be, to places where it's clearly not. And I think a lot of it is getting people over it, right? So with music and with online video, people used to buy physical media. And so it took a while to divest them of the sense that you needed that. Now, that wasn't too hard with video because people were used to the video, cassette library type places. And it was a thing people had in their head that, oh, yeah, I could pay $3 and I could watch it once. And so people had that sense and they were happy. And so it was not too hard. Same with, when music started to be available online, there was pirating, and then there were like Apple came in and did $1 a song, and it just felt silly to people, or at least a large portion of the population, at that price, not to buy. But that was step one to getting you used to having your music library online. Step two was, well, what we'll start doing is making it either ad-driven, or which is a form of subscription, or direct subscription. And so now suddenly you've got a generation, and an upcoming more generations who are totally used to the idea that music exists in a cloud and you buy it per month. You don't buy the actual music, and you kind of just also hope that support is going to the artist somehow through that system. So I don't think subscribing to things is wrong. But everyone, I mean, the classic, the dream in business is the gym membership, where 80% of people are paying a reasonable price for 3 days a week, but nobody, but like 2% of people use it at that rate. And so a lot of the time you're making a good portion of your money out of people who aren't even there, right? And that's the kind of corporate dream, because it's scalable, it's very profitable. And so people, are just pushing and pushing and pushing to find out how to get everyone into that mode, I'm sure, like every car maker's dream is that a new car turns up in your driveway and you're like, oh, I forgot to cancel my subscription, and they get another $50,000 for it. If they could make it happen, they would.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's I understand the angle that some products require a subscription and it makes sense to pay it, right? But a lot of them, it doesn't really make sense. And not only that, but when you also have a shift, like an economic shift, where through constant inflation paired with, wages that don't keep up, right? You end up in a situation where you have everybody's trying to replicate this business model, and at the same time, the capacity to pay for all the subscription of normal people is reduced drastically, right?
Yeah.
It was one thing when Netflix was like $7.99. It's a whole other thing when it's $24.99 and you can only watch HD. And if you want 4K, you have to pay another $5. And if you want to have HDR, you got to pay another $5, right? So it's one of these. It's not necessarily a bait and switch, but it's like a slippery slope combined with socioeconomic situation where it's not really sustainable. Like, how do you, let's say you're an internet business and you see all these things happening, you understand your market, you see, like kids not being able to afford something simple like a Spotify subscription because it's just too damn expensive. How do you think, like, how do you get ahead of the curve? What would you be looking at?
You mean in terms of like, how would I?
How would you pivot? Would you tackle this market? Not just leveraging a business model, but just looking at how the internet works today. Like, how would one think about these things?
Yeah, I mean, think about rectifying them. I'm thinking is what you mean. Yeah, I mean, I think the thing to look at is, and this is similar to something we said last week, where and I think I mentioned it. It's not necessarily evilly driven, and in fact, this is the actual term for this I learned from David, my co-founder. Of you get into what's called a Red Queen race, right? So if you and I are both offering music services online, and your subscription service is slightly more profitable than my sales service, then you've got more ammunition to advertise and to spruce up various things like the actual delivery product, etc., etc. And so I need to look at competing with you on those things for profitability to be able to advertise and so forth, or I'm going to keep losing market share, perhaps even though I have technically the better product, right? Mm-hmm. Because if people aren't realizing that, or if mine's better value, but it's not clear initially, then I get into a situation where I kind of need to mimic you as well. So I think that's what you've seen is, like streaming is nuts, because we had that whole thing, we had piracy rampant, and then the solution was actually make it possible for people to get the content at a reasonable amount. And you're right, like $7.99 if you watch any amount of TV, if you're watching a show. And for me, that's fun. I've subscribed to something for a show I particularly wanted to see and then stopped subscribing because, and it was worth whatever it was a week to watch that. That's, was the model. But now it's clearly like, oh, okay, it's gone. People have worked out, okay, this definition thing, like that's a way we can change what we pay. Oh, we might actually look at limiting hours. Right, so whereas part of the allure of $7.99 Netflix was like nobody had the time, but if you wanted to, you could watch it 20 hours a day for that, etc. And they're just trying to work out how to limit that. And what you're ending up with is basically the old studio system, where it's either trying to game what product there is, trying to not force, but work the market so that they've got exclusive actors access to, say, a particular actor or particular content, and then they use that to drive the price. And over time, it's got into this hellscape where if you wanted to subscribe to the major channels, it's like way more than US cable ever used to be.
Yeah, exactly. There's this concept of money is made for bundling and unbundling of services, right? And first you bundle them, now you unbundle them, right? And it's always how much value can I extract? But listening,
there's a service in Australia called Hubble or something, and I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, because I was looking at paying far too much for things different children wanted, etc. And it turned out all it was a way to like pay once. It wasn't saving you any money. It was just like these guys were taking a tiny cut so that the customer could pay all 19 subscriptions at once for $300. It wasn't cheaper. It was just because like it's also become such a hassle to deal with all of your subscriptions. So this was a way of like having a dashboard where you could turn them on and off, and just got billed once a month. And it's apparently quite popular because that's a service in itself these days.
But again, it reminds me of something like Blade Runner, where you have this anachronistic set design where you have this, let's say, an Art Deco building, and you have piping from a previous era, and then on top of that you have some air conditioning and some tubes going on top of that, and it's literally model on top of model on top of model, because the foundation is not really meant to sustain it, but nobody wants to change it. So in a space like, let's say, in a space like Web3, you have that opportunity, right? You can look at these fundamental issues and say, like, you know what? I think the problem here is maybe that these guys make it very, very difficult for the client or the user to leave a specific situation, right? Because if Netflix knew that, yeah, sure, you can cancel your subscription, but they know you can't buy those shows anywhere else, right? But if the model was in such a way that the shows were available to everyone, and everyone could build their own subscription service and buy access to the shows, right? Yeah. Then you would end up in a situation, I'm thinking, where they knew that if they leave us, they might go to some other guy and never come back.
Yeah. You can tell that, like, that's the problem in a nub by going right back to the start of computing. And very early on, when music companies and TV companies, etc., realized, primarily music, because it was audio only was easier to deliver on the early internet, and so it was the one that hit piracy, etc. first. But it's basically the same in both cases. Very quickly, the music industry and other players started lobbying for government protection. Right, so they started lobbying very, very early to stop you using your computer for some of the things it could do, like replicating music. Right, so they wanted to put clipper chips and things, which people forget, but they wanted to mandate controls into computers, and like the kind of early versions of the California age verification stuff. The original rules were also completely terrible because they were like written in a way that like mandated things that were only applicable to like 2/3 of the actual computers on the market because they were so specific. And they were clearly written by people who were not thinking about how computers work, but rather trying to reinstate a system where you couldn't exit, the studio system or the A&R system for music, where artists had to get a company to actually get, distribution, and purchasers had no choice but to buy from those monopolists because it was illegal to reproduce music outside of these licenses, etc. And so you had a black market, but aside from that, it was pretty well contained. And part of the reason for that was it was reasonably easy to to police this stuff. And in places like Hong Kong or whatever, I remember Australian tourists would come back with like suitcases half full of media, of like dodgy copies of Wham or whatever it was from Hong Kong, because it wasn't well policed there for whatever, either a lack of intent or inability. And I think it was probably a combination of both. But so you can see right from the beginning, so I'm kind of going on a big arc here, but right from the beginning, industry wanted to bring in these restrictions to stop people leaving or stop people having these options. And what's happened, I think, over time is there's no less desire for that, but the industries have gotten better at just building that stuff themselves. So, they've gotten DRM and so forth in to make it less possible to do things like copy, etc. And then they also got savvy about bundling, and like you're saying, like being very clever about delivering these things in a way where it was right on the edge of possible to copy, but then also if you did copy, you're likely enough to get caught that it was an issue or it was troublesome and you didn't want to do it. And so they've tried to keep this lock on users leaving and moving around freely. And they've managed, I think, very well to, by and large, sell people this idea that things like copyright, etc., are, vital to keep artists fed, etc. When in fact, if you look at who's actually benefiting from, the great majority of artists in any field would probably benefit from the complete abolition of copyright. Because for most artists out there, if I went and used their picture as my wallpaper and it got super popular, that would just be positive, right? Like it would be exposure and valuable to them. There's only a very, very few artists in any given field who are actively having companies, make them better off by enforcing copyright for them. And I think, like, this has been a very clever game that's been played to try and kind of work every single angle to keep users kind of from being able to move on and move elsewhere.
Yeah, no, it makes total sense. And as someone who has had more than tangential contact with the record industry, I can tell you that most of that money does not go to the artist. Otherwise, nobody would bother with this industry. It's just, worse still, depending on how you look at it, most of them feel that they are 100% entitled to that money. And to some extent, it is correct because they do manage to get the artist in a lot of places and get exposure. But it's one of those things where it's very difficult to create a set of rules that everybody can go by, especially when one side can always change the rules. And I can tell you the artist is not that side. Right? The artist can only change the rule by getting famous, which is like 1 in a million, right? But for all the other ones, they just have to, bite the bullet and take whatever deal they get. But, you know, I'm
Well,
thinking, yeah, go ahead.
and the classic studio system, right? So you make it so that to become the anointed artist, to get to be in the boy band or whatever, you've had to go through a bunch of steps that have demonstrated to you that by the time you get there, the last thing you're going to do is throw it all away, right? On pushing pushing your people around, etc. And so yes, unless you're like a Prince or a Bowie or like a really distinct artist of their time, you don't get to tell record companies what you want to do, right?
Yeah, and both Prince and Michael Jackson found out that even if you are a big star, you
Yeah,
cannot tell record
they
labels what to do. They will get
right.
you
They had
eventually.
big fights about that stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's true, but right. So we kind of understand. I understand the how it gets there. Right. It's not a direct path. It's not really something that people do because they're mean or
Hmm.
greedy. Because maybe they're a little mean and they're a little greedy, but it's just something that kind of stacks over time, and it ends up being in this like situation where everybody's looking at it
Yep.
like, how did we get here, right?
Yep.
So here comes the counter the counter question, right? How did we get here was the first question.
Mm.
The other question is, what is the remedy for doing this kind of business in the context of the internet, in the context
Hmm.
of Web3, like in the context of the changes that we want to see implemented in the world?
Yep. Well, I think there's a lot of pieces to the puzzle, and there's the way I kind of see it is it comes from two sides, right? So one side is from empowering creators, etc., to deliver what they're doing, right? So that they're not requiring, and we kind of touched on this in previous episodes as well. Like there was a time when scientific publishing, the ability to have a paper written by someone in Augsburg or something get to Tsinghua University in Beijing at some point and be in the library and be there for anyone doing that science really was quite an achievement and good work. Same with music. Some kid in Memphis records an album and I'm in Azerbaijan and I've got a chance of hearing it because there's recording studios and distribution and so forth that can get the music across the gap. So there's replacing that with something that artists have control of, right? On the one side. And then on the other side is enforcing or making a space in which delivery of business models is all about delivery to users and not about being able to enclose and rent seek. And if you can marry those two things together, you've got a chance, right? Because, and we'll take the simpler example because it gets much more complicated if you have things like a $20 billion movie or something that like needs a lot of capital, etc. But if you look at something simple like delivering music to users, the having the pieces of the puzzle there at the fingertips of artists to be able to interact with and get funding from directly from an audience, right? It's all pretty grassroots when you have a band playing at the local pub and you pay $5 at the door, and yet there's still friction between the owner of the pub and the band at the end of the day about who spent what on beer and how many people came and what the door take should have been, etc., etc. But that's much more doable than like organizing a concert, stadium tour or whatever. And so if you look at where artists are, we'll take music because it's a simple one. Delivering music to individuals is now a zero friction thing. The question is, how do you get a reward for that, and how can you do that with the least rent being extracted, right? Now, even if you just have credit card payments on your personal website, you're going to pay a lot to the credit card companies, and you're going to get the gate kept the hell out of all sorts of things because you'll need as an artist, you'll have to set up a company that can handle credit card processing and all sorts of stuff. And so companies step in and they do that, and you start to head back to where we were, where you have power accumulating in Shopify or whoever it is that's providing that gateway. So Step one for me is give artists ways to do things like deliver their content, you know, using encryption and other tools to be able to request payment for it. Right. So that's the one side, and then the other side is making sure that the rails everything is delivered on, whatever you're using, ensure that people can't be locked in. So if that content is then delivered to users encrypted, and then they get a decryption key and they can decrypt it and it's theirs, then there's nothing holding you to the subscription service you're on, and you can go and look elsewhere. And that means that artists don't necessarily have to only sell directly then to their audience, because you can have vendors and middle people, right? You might write an excellent blog on Northern Irish hip hop, discussion I was having last night, and people, bands in that area might then get into a deal with you where there's, if people come via your site to subscribe to their music, they'll do a deal with you because they're happy about it, because they know you're genuinely doing that. If you start abusing that position, they'll just stop doing it, right? But so you can have these much more organic things, and if you bundle up, you might say to a bunch of artists, look, I'd like to release a monthly curated package of music that I'd like to sell to people. It's just you and the artist. You don't have a company in between, etc. And if you're doing a terrible job of that, but I'm doing a good job of that, well, people can choose which one they want, and there's nothing to lock you in. Building those kind of systems, I think, is the way you can start to untangle this.
Right. So what I'm hearing here is that there are too many entities solving problems, and creating solutions in the stack, and
Yeah.
each and every one of these parts has an economic incentive to just balloon itself, right?
Right.
So you end up with this very bloated system because there is no limiting factor to what they can get away with eventually, right? Because
Right.
there's all these
People don't
yeah.
mind paying for a genuine service, right? You're at home, it's raining, you've got no time, and someone delivers you a pizza. You're grateful for the service and you'll pay for it. If there's only one pizza delivery option by mandate of some kind or whatever, or the local mob have scared off everybody else, then it starts to turn to shit, right? And it's not because pizza delivery is a bad idea and no one should pay for it. It's because you're locked into one provider, right? So everyone in that space is going to try, right? Like you say, intermediaries, there's nothing wrong with an intermediary if they're doing something useful. It's a matter of trying to construct a system where the only intermediaries are ones that are there by the choice of both of the people they're intermediating, right? And if you can do that, I think you're on the way.
Yeah, exactly. Because I'm thinking, like, if everyone's, let's say you have Uber, Spotify, Stripe, Adobe, AWS, right? And Meta, right? You have these huge network effects. Each and every one of them is just gonna try to like wiggle, get more and more out of your pocket, right? Then, in reality, the counter to this behavior would be some sort of network effect negating solution where the actual service in itself cannot grow beyond the actual cost, and then added value can be put and used as a differentiator instead.
There's a beautiful example of this in the world where you can see exactly how this plays out. So in Australia, in the 90s, we had the old state telecom company, and you had a state telecom company here because Australia is enormous and there's basically not many people here, and so running the cables was, you needed government level funding to run a cable between two towns with tiny populations and be able to take the angle on the 100-year return on the investment, right? Over time, the state-owned, companies then started having retail stores with mobile phones. And politicians got up and said, why does the state own retail shops? And so the answer to that was to sell the state telecom company, all of it, rather than saying, well, yes, you're quite right. That doesn't make any sense. Why don't we just sell off that bit and say, yes, you should compete? And you can see that this happened in almost all of the world over that 15, 20-year period. And you see that some countries took the angle of, okay, the state will run or regulate a group of companies to create the network, and then there'll be another layer of horizontally integrated, not vertically, companies that can sell you time on that network. But the network operator has to, not arbitrarily, equally, without favor, sell network bandwidth to those companies. They can't play favorites or whatever. And those countries that did that got a really great deal. They got a good quality network, and they got good competition and customer service, etc., for the users in those countries. What happened in Australia is, in a country where you can barely afford to have one network, we ended up with 3 physically separate networks. So you had 3 mobile phone towers in profitable areas and none in places where it was less profitable. And you have a network effect where the old state-run company is basically the only place to go for certain users, because they're the only ones with a big enough network that if you're rural, you kind of have to use them. And so nobody loves them because they're terrible, because they have a captive audience. And it's you've got number portability, but it's still difficult to switch between the 3 of them. And I think it's like we have this perfect example of why the problem happens and what the structure needs to be to stop it from happening. Basically, where you have vertical integration between the infrastructure, the service, and the user, service delivery to the user all in one column, it becomes difficult to move between providers, and those vertically integrated groups can try and expand their coverage across the breadth of the market, hopefully taking it over and becoming a monopoly. Where you have a horizontal stack of each piece of that puzzle has to sell its service, to the lower one, equitably, you end up with much, much better service, etc. And a lot of, big international treaties, etc., about at a state-to-state level, countries have worked this out and they force that kind of structure. But when it comes to their own domestic markets, often they don't. And when it comes to the internet, that stuff's grown up pretty much organically, and there's almost no control of that. So what we've gotten is more and more vertical integration, where, to the point that there are kids in China that have WeChat phones that only run WeChat. There is no internet. They only, everything is delivered through that service, that company's device. And you can see like that, what that ends up causing in terms of the market.
Right. So I hear what you're saying, but I can also see a parallel to what Sato is building here, because it is literally very similar to this horizontal network that you mentioned,
Yeah.
right? I'm not being crazy making that parallel, because it's literally
No, that's the principle that we're built. Well, not the principle. It's a principle, and it's a principle when it comes to how should things be delivered. And the way you do that, I mean, it's kind of, in software development, you have this concept of encapsulation, right? Big, very complicated pieces of software become completely unusable and messy. So what you end up doing is you say, this bit deals with taking raw video in and it outputs video. And there's a team that work on that, and what they guarantee to everybody is that these things can come in and those things will go out, and this is how you make your order, and that's how it happens. And we'll make sure this thing keeps doing it. And if you want to add a feature, you ask us, and we'll negotiate it, and we'll do it. Right? And what you end up with is these pieces that talk a language that anyone else in the building other pieces of software can consume. They know reliably you deliver this thing out the end. And so it's sort of like that concept is what we said was what you need is there's a universal, simple method of communication inside of which is the transaction. It has to and from addresses, and those are universally broadcastable, right? So anyone can send one of these base level messages to anybody else, right? Then you can put whatever you like in those messages, right? But you can't build a system where if you want to get the content of my messages, you have to come to me for permission to send them to someone else, right? That's a different piece of the puzzle, and you can't control that. So you could make a piece of software where you're the only one who could decrypt it. For instance, you have some special magic source binary thing that you deliver to users, and you could have them use that on Cyto, and yes, that would work. But you have no way to force users into that, and you'd have to make that the popular one over the version that has multiple clients and has various ways to do it. And you have none of the tools of being able to say, well, I'll only sell this through certain record stores, or I'll only sell this to Visa card customers, or whichever way you use to control that. So that's very much so. You're absolutely right. It's that analogy of making sure that each of these layers speaks a standard language to any layers on either side, so you can replace one provider at the layer that you need above you or below you with another, and there's nothing anyone can do to stop that being possible.
Exactly, and I think another very interesting plus of this sort of architecture is, because people always complain about the blockchain world that you cannot roll back transactions, right? But nobody talks about the fact that you cannot roll back 6 months spent on Instagram or on Facebook because you have all your friends there, all your messages, all your pictures. Yeah. On Sato, you can roll back 5 years because you can just move from one place to another and you take all your data with you. Yeah. And that's a sort of rollback that is non-existent in today's internet.
Yeah, well, it's also who has the power to do that, right? So at the same time, I've got personal Gmail. I thought I was cool in 2006 because I got an early-ish invite, and I've had Gmail accounts ever since for various things. And I haven't moved off, not because I love the Googles, but it's because it's a pain to do. It's difficult to do, and I'm a sysadmin by training as much as anything else. So that ability, it just flips that on its head, where the ability to roll forward and back is with the user, right? And it's baked in that you can't really do anything about that. So if the simplest way to understand is if I send an encrypted transaction and I send someone the key or half the key, then I can, me and only me, I'm the only person that can decrypt that in the future. It doesn't matter who's got the transaction or what's going on, right? I have the control over that content. That's just different to a user admin-based system where my identity is essentially a row in a database, and then what happens after that is entirely at the edict of the person running the database.
Exactly, and again, to come back and tie it all together with the idea of why everything is a subscription. How could one solve, let's say, this specific scenario? Somebody sends me a PDF. I want to listen to it when I go for a walk. The app that allows me to do that costs $9.99 a month and requires me to create an account.
Yeah.
How would I solve this problem so that guys or people that find my app but just have one file that they want to listen to, or two files, how could you get those type of clients to not directly bounce when they see that $10 subscription? Because there is no option to just listen once, or right?
Yeah.
and it kind of changes because you have the payment rails, you have the business models that are built in a certain way, and you
Mm-hmm.
don't have the infrastructure that can say like, you know what, it cost me 2 cents to send you the data, it cost me 2 cents to receive it. I charge you another 5 cents because I built this service.
Yeah.
Here it's 9 cents per, you know, page.
Mm-hmm.
Listen to how many pages you want.
Well, I think, yeah, comes down to essentially like it's not just micropayments, right? Because that's been the classic dream that and a lot of crypto projects have talked about. If micropayments, that's the thing because you can do what you're talking about, right? You can have a thing where I provide a service of whatever value, and I think interestingly we're seeing that now big time with AI, where they needed a currency to talk to people about that wasn't dollars and stuff because the price of providing it across models and things went up and down. So tokens, people understand at some level, like, oh, I'm burning a lot of tokens, etc. They've learned that actually quite quickly because people are smart. Um, but what there isn't in there is any sense of that is kind of the microtransaction dream in one way, but it's missing the other part, which is those aren't universal tokens, right? I'm buying them from one provider, right? And I can't reuse Claude tokens with DeepSeek. I can't reuse Gemini tokens with OpenAI, right? So they're not fungible across those different borders. So it's not just a matter of you could take a micropayment. It's you can take it seamlessly in a method that's always available to everybody on the network, right? And I think it even goes a little bit beyond that, where I'm actually really pro things like advertising because a lot of people will be able to buy whatever it is, dollars, whatever it is that they're paying for stuff within these micropayment systems. But some people won't. And so actually having advertising being a way of picking up a fair number of those. And if it's peer-to-peer, it's not, the money's not 90% going to the ad network, but it's actually an agreement. And if we could talk, I think, there's a good episode later on in like advertising specifically and how you can make it your friend rather than the kind of weird stalker that it's become. But believing me that that's possible, that you can have friendly advertising that's not tracking based, then that's a great way to get people that little bit of cash available so that there's like enough value sloshing around in my phone that I could use for anything. And so when I want to use this, like convert one PDF to audio, I've got that there and it can just happen seamlessly. I can just allow, see it and say, okay, 6 cents worth going to, Alex over there to read this thing to me. Great. It seems worth it. And it needs to be that seamless, right? I can't need to go and buy Alex coin to make that a thing, right? At the same time, it is actually kind of useful to be able to make Alex coin to go to enjoy X number of fun things at Alex World or whatever. Like you can still have business models like that, but for micropayments really to work, I think the way they need to be this universal interchangeable thing, this way of having those values, small amounts of value move around. And the reason I brought up advertising is I think that's also a great way to bring it into play, and it's a great way to do that while maintaining anonymity, which I think people don't think of advertising being about anonymity, but it actually gives you a way of earning money on the internet that isn't tied to every other transaction you've made. So it gives you the ability to be able to consume certain things reasonably anonymously and actually get a less tracked life.
For those of us who are well, not those of us, those of you who are new to the podcast, you might think that what's an amazing theoretical world that Richard is describing there, but no, that's actually Sado, if I'm not mistaken. Those elements actually exist on the Sado consensus in one form or another.
Yeah, I mean, if you go to this is the reason Saito is that way is the same reason I'm on the podcast. It's because we want to build an open internet. We want there to be all of these things for people, and Saito is a real system out there now that you can go and look at and use that actually embodies all of these pieces, right? We haven't got every business model that you can sustain on Saito running on Saito right now, but it's there to allow for that to happen. So you've great examples of social and video calls and all sorts of other things. But the big idea there is that this is all about these principles, and that everything there is built to create the economic incentives, but also these structural features, universal broadcast ability for everybody to manage their own identity and therefore their own encryption, the construction of the communication layer to be in these horizontally non-integrated layers so that different things can communicate with the underlying data without anyone being able to put up walls. All of those things are carefully built into Saito for these reasons, right? Because it lets people create tools that can avoid the pitfalls we've been talking about today: rent seeking, squeezing users, shrinkflating them, etc. They won't all happen automatically as a result of people building on Saito, but the winners on Saito will be the people who do these things right.
Exactly, and as the internet is becoming more and more enclosed and enshittified, having this sort of technology and bringing forward this sort of message is very important, because it tells people that, you know, there were those of, I would say us, but I mean it's mostly you and Richard who actually had the vision to see the vision to see this coming from such a long time ago, right? For your exposure to the Chinese model, and now we're seeing different parts of the world trying to adopt that model, and this. Sure.
It's a funny thing. It was in some ways it was lucky to have seen Bitcoin at the same time that we'd seen the direction the Chinese internet was heading really quickly. I had no idea, no ability to predict that, in fact, that almost all of the internet would kind of end up meeting in this same structure where we're ending up in these like corporate and or national subnets with all sorts of lock-in and rules and, you know, trying to make like, you know, real name identity. Well, yeah, and it's a real name identification. I remember telling Westerners about that being the case in China and them flipping out 10 years ago. And, you know, we now have senior politicians across the board in most Western countries pushing for systems that will at least end up enforcing that, if that's not their stated intention. But yeah, so seeing that at the same time as seeing what Bitcoin was wanting to do and trying to do for money, and understanding that the underlying technologies had the ability to prevent or forestall the same kind of enshittification of money that we've seen with the banking system, et cetera, with excluding people and rent seeking, et cetera, for data generally. And that the ability to see that, not necessarily see where the internet ended up and how badly we'd need it, but to see that you wanted to build something that was proofed against those really negative trends. Maybe was really helped by being in the right place at the right time and having this sort of two waves come together to cause a kind of, you know, ridge where we could see much more clearly maybe than we would have if we'd been elsewhere, how important it was to build things that would not suffer these same fates. On one side, why traditional blockchains can't do that, the limitations in their design, and on the other side, the issues with the internet and what it was inevitably going to come if we didn't have tools that could prevent it.
Exactly. So in other words, you're welcome. No, but it's true. I like this this one analogy that you use when it says Bitcoin is your banking, Sato is every other app.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a really good way of helping people understand what we're on about. Is like, if you get, we all remember that feeling of excitement when we started having apps on our phones, and we realized, well, this is like a new world. This is something I can take this with me. It's always there. I could rethink how I travel, how I do all sorts of things. And just imagine if all you had was banking apps to do that with on your phone. It's like, yeah, you iPhone, but all I can do is trade stocks and use the bank, right? And that's basically where blockchain technology got to, was like, yeah, everything's about trading or finance, etc. And people didn't put the time necessarily or the thought into, because obviously those financial things are lucrative, into, well, what about the rest of our lives? What about the encroaching restrictions and enshittification and enclosure on everything else we do?
Everything else will just get we'll let the free market solve that one, right? We'll just create these...
Market failures don't exist, yeah.
Exactly. We'll just create all these network effects that will just squeeze you dry for subscriptions into oblivion. Thank you so much, Richard, and thank you everybody who's been watching. We'll catch you guys next week with a very special episode, but we'll keep that a surprise.
Yes.